All right, what's going on, guys? Dan Watson, and all I can say is that we are in a crazy new release season right now because we just had the Sony 24-70 review, the Canon R7 review just went live, and you're going to see a bunch more videos dropping really soon on some new things. Plus, Sony has just introduced 3 new lenses for their APS-C cameras, and you have a 10-20mm F4 G, an 11mm F1.8, and a 15mm F1.4 G. But I'm really excited about them because the reality is that even though these are more built for like APS-C sensors like the A6400, A6600, ZVE10, I happen to also own an A7 IV. And if you're using this camera, 4K 60 in this camera only works in that crop mode, which means having some crazy small wide angle prime lenses especially would be really absolutely perfect for when I want those wide angle shots in 4K 60. Now let's say I am a little undecided because I'm going to call these lenses fix-it-in-post lenses, and you're going to see why in a second. But all of these lenses ended up being more similar in terms of quality and features with each other than I expected. But guess what? I also just got this in. This is the Sigma 16-28 f2.8, and it just got announced. So I'll be posting some BTS on IG later this week from a shoot with this lens. Full review is coming next week, so stay tuned for that. But let's start off with the 10-20mm F4 G. And this lens is just crazy small and light, 6.2 ounces, only 2.16 inches long. And it's all internal zoom, so it'll never extend past that. In fact, this is so small, it's almost small to a fault. So the hardware on this, it definitely feels a bit plasticky. It doesn't really like shout high quality, even though it does have a cool feature. There are actually 2 dials on this lens. So one is for manual focus and the other one is for zooming. And I will say these are so close to each other that it was pretty easy to accidentally spin both. But we also have a power zoom. So in addition to the dial, you also have a rocker switch on the side. And I actually really liked having this rocker switch to control the zoom even more than I thought, and even more than zooming with the ring. It definitely surprised me a bit because you don't have to like readjust your grip every time that you go to zoom with it. Now, Sony also added a few extra things. So we have a custom button on the side, and we also have an AF to manual focus switch, which is really awesome because this lens is so small. It also has dual linear focus motors, which are completely silent. Like you can put your ear right to this lens and you will struggle to hear both the zoom and the internal focus motors. And this isn't a lens that demands like super quick autofocus, but let's just say this was way faster than you will ever need for a wide angle f4, and focus breathing also seems really minimal. Now, close focusing though isn't anything to get really excited about. It's 0.14 times macro magnification, but if you throw it into manual focus, you get to 0.18 times magnification, which is okay. Now, image quality is really where things get super interesting. So this is an f4 lens, but thankfully it is really sharp, wide open. And that is both on the wide end and zoomed into 20 millimeters. It's also pretty impressive in the corners. And just to show you, this looks as sharp as the $3,000 Sony 12-24 in the corners. But what's really weird is that this lens did not get sharper when you stop it down. In fact, it looks better at f4 than at f5.6 and f8, which is something you pretty much never see. But the big issue for me is distortion. At 20 millimeters, it's okay. And at 10 millimeters, this lens is absolutely ridiculous. The amount of distortion, which would be completely unusable, except that when you use this with a Sony camera, distortion is corrected in camera for both JPEGs and for video. In fact, if you want to actually go turn off the distortion correction, you can't. It's literally mandatory that you have correction on it. So it's like Sony knew that these were going to be unusable without distortion correction. But when shooting in RAW, you will need to add distortion correction in post. Now, what's even more interesting is that Sony already has a 10-18mm f4 with optical image stabilization, which if you consider that the only APS-C cameras as of now with internal IBIS is the A6600, the 10-18 is a bit tempting. Now, the other competition I would say to this lens is probably going to be the Tamron 11-20mm. Now, that's an f2.8 lens, so it is bigger, it is heavier, it costs a little bit more, but it does have that one-stop advantage. I mean, if you're a photographer and you're shooting RAW, I think their 10-18 might be a better choice. I mean, I don't have that lens to compare it to right now, but I'm pretty sure it had way better distortion control, and you have the benefit of having stabilization. Now, I think that video shooters is really where this lens makes more sense. You have that power zoom, you have the latest features that work with focus breathing control like on the a7 IV, and for video, most newer cameras like the ZV-E10, even if they don't have the full IBIS systems built in, they have electronic stabilization that will work with this lens. It's still not the best lens in the world, but considering the price, it works pretty well, and there is not a lot of competition other than Sony, and this lens does have a few advantages, especially for video, plus that corner-to-corner sharpness. Now, why I group these together is that the 11mm really seems to follow the same formula. So it's the only one that's not a G lens, and it's also the cheapest, but honestly, it doesn't feel much worse. It has some dust and moisture resistance, and it has that AF manual focus switch on it, and a customizable focus hold button. Plus, it is 6.3 ounces, so again, crazy light, but it definitely feels like a bit of a cheaper lens in terms of build, and even the manual focus dial just feels a bit cheap compared to some of the other ones. Now, it has a 7-blade circular aperture, but bokeh looks pretty good in the center, and it's only in the corners do we start to get a little bit misshapen. Now, the autofocus. Close focusing isn't that great. It's 0.13 times macro reproduction, but it does go to a 0.2 times macro with manual focus, so that's pretty good. It does get the autofocus upgrade though, so you have 2 linear motors, and again, focusing on this is really, really fast and absolutely completely silent. But the image quality on this lens is almost the same story as the 10-20. So basically, unusable amounts of distortion on this lens without the correction turned on. And again, you can't turn this off in camera. So any videos and JPEGs will have this applied automatically. It's only for RAW files that you have to apply this in post. But I really hope that this lens would have been a little bit better in camera. Now, it's definitely a sharp lens considering this is Sony's base line of lenses. It has just a little bit of softness at f1.8, but it does get better around f2.8, but still sharp enough I would have no problem using this lens completely wide open. Now, there isn't a lot of competition here with autofocus lenses either. I think the Rokinon 12mm f2 is about as close as it gets to this one. Again, you absolutely need distortion correction applied to this lens, but if you do, it's a pretty good performer for video, not a bad option for photos, but I think it's a little bit more average than I would have hoped. But I love having a super wide angle prime lens, especially with like a crop sensor camera like the a6600, or even if you shoot video on like the Sony a7 IV, this could be a solid option, especially if you're a video shooter. Now, the 15mm is a G lens, and I was really hoping that Sony would step things up a bit for this. And as a bonus, this comes out to a 22mm lens with the crop factor. And if you have a camera with the active stabilization, it's pretty much a 24mm f1.4 lens equivalent, which is an amazing focal length and would be perfect even if you use like cameras like the a7 IV and use that crop mode on it. Now, mechanically, it does feel mostly like a step up. The manual focus wheel definitely feels better than the 11mm. You get an aperture dial that's declickable. It doesn't have a lock on it, but I don't think you will accidentally get this out of place. You also get that custom button on the side and an AF manual focus switch, and it still comes in at just 7.7 ounces. But what's interesting is that even though this is a G series lens and the 11mm isn't, it doesn't really feel like a big upgrade from that lens other than some slight physical attributes, which I never use things like this aperture ring anyway. It has the same dual linear focus motors, which again, they're really fast and silent, but not really an upgrade from the 11mm. It has the same 11-blade aperture, which is decent in the center, but definitely has a little bit of that cat's eye look in the corner. And probably worst of all, distortion. So the level of distortion on this lens is probably the least forgivable. I mean, this is a 24mm full frame equivalent, and I feel like it has fisheye levels of bulging. I mean, once you look at the JPEG file, it's fine. The video files look good with correction, but the level of fix it in post that Sony is doing with this lens is just absolutely crazy to me. I'd usually expect to have to do some level of correction on the super wide angle lenses like these right here, but I'm not usually correcting a lens like this. So if you shoot raw images, especially with this lens, plan on applying a distortion correction immediately, because this lens is so bad for a 22mm focal length equivalent that I don't even want to look at the raw files until I apply that adjustment. Now, thankfully, sharpness is pretty solid on this one. Even wide open at f1.4, it looks great. And there isn't really a ton of competition with this lens either. So you have a Sigma 16mm f1.4, but that's much larger. It has some corner sharpness issues, but it does come in about half the price as the Sony. I hope that maybe there was some form of justification that Sony used for making these without getting rid of the distortion optically. Maybe to get rid of it, it would have had to be much larger and heavier. But all three of these lenses are 100% dependent on software for making them even usable to me, which on one hand is kind of disappointing. And on the other hand, really doesn't matter that much, especially if you're shooting video or JPEG where the correction's applied automatically. Now, I'm all about small and lightweight lenses, but especially on the 15mm G lens, I'm sitting here just wondering if another 1 to 2 ounces, maybe a 1/4 inch longer, could have made this a better lens, both mechanically and optically. And I think that it would have been worth it given that this is a G series lens and typically a little bit higher quality. But definitely let me know what you guys are thinking. Plus, having a good wide angle lens is essential for like landscapes, vlogging. I shoot cars a lot and they can be awesome for that too. So definitely hit me up in the comments. Stay tuned. I am editing like crazy right now and there are some really awesome videos coming your way soon.